Hello. I just want to start by saying, pardon me, that it is a big year for Shaker Heritage Society. It's the 250th anniversary, not just of America's founding, but also of the arrival of the Shakers to our site. So, every twist and turn of the Shakers' founding narrative or origin story is impacted by the American Revolution. The Shakers even maintained that the Revolution was the providential work of God, that America needed to become the land of liberty for the sake of the Shaker gospel. Ann Lee, the leader of the Shakers, was no doubt a revolutionary in her own right. The revolution she waged was predicated on a set of ideals, just like the American Revolution, but hers was a spiritual one. While the Patriot cause sought to establish a new republic free from political tyranny, she sought to establish a spiritual kingdom within its context where the rights of conscience afforded by the newly established government could be fully realized and individual religious liberty could reign. But it's complicated, a theme developing. Ann Lee and her followers arrived in New York City in 1774, on the eve of revolution, from Manchester, England. Like so many others, they came to the New World out of a desire for religious freedom. In England at the time, there was only one state-sanctioned religion, the Church of England, whose head was the king. Essentially, church and state were one and the same. Now, the Shakers believed something radically different. Like the Quakers, they believed that there was no need for an intermediary at all, or a church hierarchy. Instead, each individual could experience the divine directly. But the Shakers combined this belief with a very active form of physical worship that involved spinning, jumping, and of course, shaking. So they were derisively called the Shaking Quakers. This is how the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing came to be known as simply the Shakers. What's more, though, they believed that Christ's second appearing had already occurred through Ann Lee and all of the Shakers, that they embodied the Christ spirit. The controversy around their beliefs was, of course, amplified by the fact that they were led by a woman. Today, plenty of people would have a hard time accepting that. So you can imagine that in the mid-1700s, when women were considered property and had no rights, this caused a stir. And in fact, it landed Ann Lee in jail. But she was resilient. While in jail, Ann Lee had a vision of building a religious community in the New World, and she set out to make that vision a reality. Back to New York City. When the Shakers arrived in 1774, revolutionary fervor was heating up. The Sons of Liberty had just executed their lesser-known Manhattan Tea Party, also a protest against British taxation. And by 1776, New York City was under siege by the British. Once again, the Shakers found themselves fleeing the arm of British law. Amidst a wave of 20,000 terrified people escaping brutality and violence, the Shakers headed up the North River, today called the Hudson, through the woods until they arrived at the site where I work, in a place then called Niskayuna, a Mohawk word for extensive cornflocks. Mohawk people lived there and used the alluvial river flats to grow corn. That summer, also, since there's someone here from Mohawk Nation who would know what I'm talking about, we were directly at the eastern entrance of the Longhouse, is right where the Shakers went to. That summer, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and the moment marked a new independence for the Shakers, too. As the war raged around them, they began to build their first community in the woods. It was centered on the Shaker principles of confession of sin, celibacy, equality, and pacifism. But no one could escape the effects of war, even in the woods. William Lee, Ann's brother, worked as a blacksmith in Albany. The artisan he worked for made nails and handcuffs for the Continental Army. The part of town where he worked was in fact a hotbed of revolutionary activity. Alexander Hamilton, the Schuyler sisters, Aaron Burr, all lived and worked in the very same neighborhood at the time that William worked there. George Washington even paid a visit. As the years went on and the revolution continued to smolder, people naturally grew weary because life in a war zone is hard. In order to muster continued support, the patriot cause became more intentional and more zealous. This meant using force. New York State created the commissioners, back to the names, created the commissioners for detecting and defeating conspiracies. These commissioners were charged with snuffing out any perceived threat. They began a mass incarceration campaign, which is to say that they arrested anyone they viewed as a threat. About 10% of the Hudson Valley's white male population was arrested for disaffection or lack of enthusiasm for the war, the revolution. As pacifists, the Shakers certainly fit into the threat category. In 1780, the commissioners caught wind that the Shakers were successfully preaching pacifism. Ann Lee's message was this: "It is impossible for a person to live in wars and fighting and to be a person of God." She told anyone who would listen that these two things were mutually exclusive. On July 24th, Mother Ann, her brother William, and 5 other Shakers were arrested. The charges were that by their conduct and conversation, the Shakers disturb the public peace and are daily dissuading the friends of the American cause from taking up arms in defense of their liberties. She was first held at the Albany courthouse and prison. Which is the picture on the left. But she attracted crowds. So they transferred her 70 miles south down the Hudson to the commissioner's jail in Poughkeepsie. This slide also shows the minutes from the hearing of the commissioners for detecting and defeating conspiracy, actually her releasement trial. The commissioners use her married name, Standerin, although history remembers her by her maiden name. So starting about 1/4 of the way down, resolved upon the application of William Lees, that Ann Standerin, who was some time ago sent to Poughkeepsie on account of her influence in bringing persons to the persuasion professed by the people called Shaking Quakers, the said persuasion having a tendency to alienate the minds of people from their allegiance to the state by inculcating an opinion of the unlawfulness of taking up arms in defense of the American cause. And it appearing that many of the persons of the said persuasion have been reformed, and that no further evil is to be apprehended from her influence or example, therefore resolved that said Ann Standerin have permission to return to Niskayuna on the said William Lees and James Whitaker, entering into a bond conditioned for the said Ann Standerin's appearing before any 3 of the commissioners for conspiracies when thereunto required for her good behavior, and not saying or consenting to any matters or things inconsistent with the peace and safety of the United States. And then you can see that her bond was paid by her brother William and James Whitaker, who would be her successor. And maybe people who are more knowledged than I am in the Revolutionary era more broadly, 100 pounds was a lot of money. I think it was like close to $15,000 or $20,000. So the commissioners claim that her message of pacifism was evil. That must have been a really tough pill to swallow. Notice that she's not accused of disaffection, as most people were. Instead, they pinpoint her influence and example. As a religious leader, she had tremendous sway. And lastly, she's essentially released on good behavior. I suspect that she was not present for this hearing because I can't imagine that she would have paid lip service to the commissioners. And she most certainly did not begin to subscribe to their version of good behavior after her release. So do not confuse pacifism with complacency. She didn't stop. Instead, she took her show on the road. She traveled around New England and successfully spread her gospel. She continued to face violent persecution, but just as in England, Anne Lee and her followers were ready to face the consequences of standing by their beliefs. No one really knew what to make of the Shakers. Some New Englanders thought they were part of an English plot to neutralize the populace with religious fervor and pave the way for British reconquest of England. The Shakers were beaten, kidnapped, and driven out of town after town, but gaining converts at every step of the way. So, like I said, it's complicated. In spite of all of their seemingly terrible experiences, the Shakers did believe that the revolution was the providential work of God and that they owed their existence to the Patriot victory, that America was destined to become the land of liberty for the sake of the Shaker gospel. During the missionary journey through New England, a man named Issachar Bates, who was a fifer during the Revolution, saw Anne Lee preaching in Massachusetts, and he was convinced by what she had to say. He had a wife and kids, and it took him some time to commit to joining the celibate Shakers, but he eventually did in 1801. And the necessity of patriot victory for religious freedom, or what some might call the rights of conscience, to have the right to follow one's own conscience, was not lost on him. This is the sheet music for a hymn written by Issachar Bates after the war. It's called The Rights of Conscience, and this is actually just the first two verses of 17. It's a long song, and I will sing the first verse for you. Rights of conscience in these days now demand our solemn praise. Here we see what God has done by his servant Washington, who with wisdom was endowed by an angel through the cloud, and led forth in wisdom's plan to secure the rights of man. The line, here we see what God has done by his servant Washington, and rights of freedom will maintain, and our independence gain. This hymn is extolling Washington and is used as a rallying cry for taking full advantage of the rights of conscience. The hymn also goes on to point out the need to continue the trend and become liberated from economic slavery and to eradicate chattel slavery in this land. Yet Issachar manages to put a tidy bow on all of this complication. Later on in verse 8, Issachar simplifies the undeniably complicated nature of the Shakers' experience of the revolution. He writes, "Each one seeks his neighbor's good, no more shed each other's blood. Let the eyes of priests and kings view the eagle's spreading wings. These are to a woman given. Guard the place where she is driven." He's painting an image of an eagle, presumably a bald eagle, flying above Anne Lee, guarding her and the other Shakers, while kings and priests look on, unable to stop her in the land of liberty. Thank you.